Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. So, we're going to be talking about signage, and this is one of my favorite topics. So, we're going to be talking about just different signage best practices for the design and the development, and some of the strategic thinking that when we focus on the messaging of signage. The way that I'm going to position this talk is that we're going to focus on signage as a forum of marketing communications. It's a forum of visual marketing or marketing communications. So here is the agenda. Hopefully everybody can hear me and the sound is good. I'm just going to go in the chat. I want to make sure. Okay, good. Okay. So I'm going to talk very briefly about where I work. I am an academic librarian in a public university system called CUNY, which is the City University of New York in New York City. Then I'm going to talk about just kind of introducing you to defining briefly what is a sign and distinguishing between signage and wayfinding. So, talking about the difference between signage and wayfinding. And then also kind of positioning this as the discussion of signage as a form of marketing communications. And then talk about the different kinds of signs that you might see at your library and the different categories of signage production. Then I'm going to talk about one of the research methodologies of assessing your signage by looking at a signage audit and discussing the different phases of a signage audit, and then discussing just identifying some research techniques and methods that relate to signage and wayfinding. And then, of course, as I kind of conclude the discussion, I'll be talking about best practices for both print and digital signage. And then, of course, my favorite is to show you some before and after examples of really horrible looking signs, and then just more improved signage, and of course show you signs from my library. And then I'm going to be talking about how to maintain effectiveness by discussing buy-in and also again efficiency and effectiveness. And then I'm going to wrap things up by concluding by talking about the final recommendations on the best practices for designing effective signage. So I would definitely invite you to participate in the chat if there's anything that I've discussed that you need clarification. And I'm going to try very hard to, speak a little slower and enunciate because I normally talk very quickly. I have a lot of nervous energy, so and I really want to be able to convey, the information to you and to really, teach you some of the best practices on how to think really strategically and critically about the signage that you're creating. So a little bit of an introduction. Vicky provided a wonderful, introduction of myself. I've been working at CSI, which is the College of Staten Island, which is part of the City University of New York system, for just over 14 years. I've been working in libraries for about 30 years. I obtained my MLS in 2000. And I've been in the United States for 14 years. I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, and I work at CSI. It is a comprehensive college, which means that we offer associate's, bachelor, master, and doctoral degrees. So it's really comprehensive. And it's one of the seven four-year colleges in the CUNY system. There are 25 campuses in New York City. And CSI, where I work, is the largest campus in the CUNY system. We are spread across 204 acres, and we have one library in the middle of campus, and we have 13,000 students, and our library is 3 floors and 30,000 square feet, and we have 14 full-time librarians and 10 adjuncts or part-time. We have 65 staff in total. I think we have a reduction of staff after the pandemic, and I returned to my physical campus at the end of August of 2021. So our building was closed from March 2020 until the physical campus reopened in August of 2021, and that's when I started, physically working on campus. So during that time, we've had a lot of signs that have been created by the university. that now are really outdated. So it's been my pleasure to remove those signs because there's nothing worse than an outdated sign. And a lot of these signs about social distancing and wearing face masks are so outdated. At least at my university, they're not mandated anymore. So it's been a pleasure removing them because I think one of the biggest observations that I've had is libraries produce too much signage. There is an explosion of signage, there's too much. And when there's too much signage, it becomes ineffective. And that's something I'm going to be repeating a lot. So as I move on, what is a sign? What is a sign? A sign is anything that can be interpreted by another person. That's really what signs are. It is anything that can be decoded and where a sign conveys meaning by producing codes, pictures, colors, and words. So signs are going to be a combination of all of those things. So that means that a sign would have different kinds of elements. And so, for example, in terms of two theorists of signs, I'm going to very briefly talk about Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Peirce. So Ferdinand de Saussure kind of discusses a sign as having kind of two different types of elements: the signified and the signifier. And the signified and the signifier come together to form a sign. So in this particular case of the stop sign, right, the signifier would be the physical element of the red light, but the signified would be the meaning of that red light. So the physical element of the physical sign plus the meaning of that sign come together to form the sign's meaning, which is what Ferdinand de Saussure kind of conceptualizes the idea of a sign. Now, of course, Charles Peirce, it's a little bit different. Charles Peirce, who is an American, he theorizes a sign as having three elements: the representamen, the object, and the interpretant. So the object would be, in this case, the car, that is the physical element that would engage in the actual representamen, which is the physical red light. So the car will interact or engage with the physical element of the red light, and together it would form the interpretant, which is the meaning of that sign. So again, Charles Peirce focuses on three elements: interpretant, object, and representamen. So those are just two different super short, brief summaries of how two theorists from a long time ago, de Saussure and Peirce, how they conceptualize the meaning of a sign. So signs produce meaning. That's important. Now, of course, wayfinding is a bit different. Wayfinding is broader. Wayfinding relates to using different spatial literacy tools to help you navigate through a built environment. A built environment is a human-made environment, so it's not natural. So a human-made environment might be a hospital, an airport, a shopping mall, a library, so any human-made environment. What's important is that people don't want to get lost. So wayfinding enables, it uses different types of tools to help users enter the environment, navigate through the environment, and exit the environment without getting lost. So again, wayfinding is all about entering a human-made facility like a library, or again, a hospital, a shopping mall, an airport. Airports are my favorite, navigating through there. So again, one thing that comes to mind is IKEA, right? IKEA has a very elaborate wayfinding system so that you are able to enter the IKEA store, navigate through the store, and then exit the store without getting lost, right? So that's known as means of egress. So all of the different concepts that I will be talking about I will repeat them, and I also just mentioned that they're all in my book. So I will briefly summarize how fantastic my book is, because it really is made for the beginner, and kind of teaching you how to think a little bit more critically and strategically about the signs that you create. So wayfinding is the broader perspective, and signage is a piece of the wayfinding puzzle. So some of the elements of wayfinding include physical structures like landmarks, directional signage, as well as different architectural features and maps and directories. Okay, so to position this talk, I'm going to be grounding this discussion as kind of like starting with the idea of signage as a form of marketing communications. It's part of visual marketing, and I think it's one of the most important aspects of marketing communications, because signage is used to educate, to identify spaces, to promote services and resources, to enforce policy, and to provide directions. So signage is definitely a form of communications as part of the marketing umbrella. Now, the types of signage, I actually am showing you signage that we use at our library. So you'll notice that some of the signage that we have at our library, sometimes it's positioned in portrait mode, and sometimes it's positioned in landscaped. That's on purpose. So thinking about how you design your signage, whether you're designing it in portrait or a landscape, that's something to think about. And the different types of signage that we have in our library are policy signage, promotional or instructional signage, wayfinding signage, as well as identification signage. You'll also know that when you can see in the video, on the screen, that it's color coded. So very often the signs look the same. They have a unified look and feel. They have a common design. They have a common visual consistency, because that's super important. But there are slight differences, like in this case, the borders have different color variations, which are based on the college branding. So everything is based, I work for an academic institution, so I am guided by the branding guidelines of the institution that I work for. So again, you'll notice the slight differences in the colors. My favorite color is purple, but I don't get to choose the color, because the purple is not part of the college colors, unfortunately. So you'll notice that here are some of the different samples of signage that are in the 4 different categories. Now, in terms of signage production, most of our signs are produced in-house. So, again, this is supposed to be a numeric bulleted list, so I apologize that it all says 111. So we produce signs in-house, that's DIY, do-it-yourself. There are institutional signage, which is produced by the colleges, again, the colleges buildings and grounds, that's called B&G, which is the part of the college department which focuses on planning, on planning the facility. So that relates to more institutional signage. So buildings and grounds focuses on the more consistent institutional signage, but we do signage in the library as more localized. Then there's also temporary signage, which is something that has been initiated by the ADA. So anything by the ADA, we'll talk about the ADA, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. So anything that is 7 days or earlier is known as temporary signage. And that has a lifespan of 7 days. Okay, so what are signage audits? So a signage audit allows you to evaluate and to quantify some of the characteristics of your sign, and it is an evaluation method used to understand some of your strengths and weaknesses, and it helps to identify some of the issues that relate to your library's signage. Some of the issues that I have seen over the years, because I have been studying signage since 2012, I would say I started really devoting myself to signage projects from 2012. Some of the issues and some of the problems of library signage would be unclear mixed messages that are really inconsistent, having outdated messages, having too many signs, poorly placed signs that are just placed randomly throughout the library. Signs with a message that are punitive or passive aggressive. Signs that have an inconsistent design, so they don't look like they're unified. They don't look like they're part of the library, so they have a design that's inconsistent. And then signs that have too much text. So again, we want to focus on, conveying a message with at least the least amount of words possible, right? Convey your message with, again, you can say 1,000 words and you can have a really, really, really big message, and you don't have to be wordy. There's, practice not being wordy. Practice with, using as few words as possible to convey a big message. And again, that takes practice. So, the first phase of a signage audit is to take an inventory. So when you're taking an inventory, you are really evaluating both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. You're counting the number of signs in your library, and then you're documenting the types of signs into different categories by classifying them into different groups and categories. Then you're identifying the problems in your signs, such as physical damage, the messaging, the placement of the signs, the design of the signs, the branding, whether the message is outdated, the tone of the message, the accuracy of the message, the words that you're using, right? You want to be able to use consistent words, right? Almost like a controlled vocabulary. You want to use the same words that are familiar, and you don't want to kind of use different words that might be confusing. So thinking about message, thinking about words, thinking about the currency. Are your signs current? Are they outdated? That's something that you have to always think about. I will be sharing with you the idea that signs are living documents that have to always be updated and constantly revisited. So when you're in phase two, when you have kind of done a quantitative and qualitative assessment of the signs by counting and by documenting the kinds of signs, then you want to do a deeper analysis. So that means you want to conduct signage research, and there's a little asterisk because I'm going to talk about signage research in a few moments. And there are different signage research techniques, like a signage audit, to study the effectiveness and the purpose of the sign. Signs should only exist when your users have questions. So if a question comes up at your library and your users are asking the same question over and over and over, then maybe it's time to produce a sign. So but if people are very aware of a library service or resource, and people aren't asking questions, then there might not be a need to produce that sign, right? Signs really need to fulfill the needs and inform your users when there's a gap in knowledge. So part of phase two is really focusing on this self-assessment and asking, are these signs produced to respond to user concerns and user needs? And signs should also not only teach you, but also inform policy, but raise awareness and promote services and resources. So signs have, again, a multi-pronged function of informing, educating, enforcing policy, providing instructions, providing directions, and of course, identify spaces. Now, my favorite part of signs is replacing. In my library, we removed like 45% of the signs and we replaced them, but we replaced them with less. So that's the key. If you want to be efficient, replace the signs with less, because most of the time, your library, and I don't mean your library, but a lot of libraries have too many signs. And having too many signs is definitely overwhelming, and it kind of creates a very negative user experience to your users, because I think that it might contribute to library anxiety when there's too many signs. So you want to remove the signs and you want to replace them with signs with an updated message, updated content, updated design, and having a consistent design, something that is visually and textually consistent. And you want to think strategically about where you place the signs. I will talk about that very soon, because you want to place your signs in a very purposeful manner, in a thoughtful manner, and in a strategic manner. You don't want to place your signs just randomly. When you are replacing the signs, you want to document the changes that you've made, and you want to keep track of those changes. Keeping track using a locator map, keeping track of the approximate locations of those signs are very, very useful, very efficient, and also keeping track of the number of signs and the kinds of signs. So having a tracking system, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet, keeping track of, again, the number of signs, the kinds of signs, the categories of signs, the approximate locations of signs, and where you're placing them is a really, really, really efficient way of managing your signage system. Think of it as a system. Don't think of it as an individual sign. Think of it as part of a network or a system of many signs together. So there are many different types of research methods or techniques that you can use to gather data from your users that will inform you on how to better replace your signs, better update your signs. So a lot of these research techniques and methodologies are often associated with user experience or UX, as well as anthropology. Anthropology uses a lot of ethnographic research methods, and ethnographies are relating to observational studies, and a lot of UX is related to observational studies. So some of the signage research methods and techniques include ethnographic research, which is associated with the discipline of anthropology, as well as UX mapping or user experience mapping, cognitive mapping, usability testing, which is one of my favorites, A/B testing, which is comparing two different iterations of the same sign, interviewing different library users and using focus groups. I would really emphasize using semi-structured qualitative interviews and interviewing a small sample. And of course, if you obtain IRB approval, you can, record it, and you might want to publish the results. If you are keeping the data internal, you do not need IRB approval. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, where if you're planning on publishing the results, then you would want IRB approval, which is basically ethics approval. If you're keeping the data internal, you do not need IRB approval. I think one of the most popular methods of gleaning data would be survey research. Survey research is the least expensive, and you get the largest sample. So I highly recommend surveys as a very inexpensive way of obtaining a really large sample of data that will really inform your decisions. Remember that when you update your signage, it should be informed by data. Data will drive your decisions. That's like marketing 101, that we all have the best of intentions, but we have to do research to obtain data to help make decisions when we are engaged in marketing activities, as well as updating our library's signage. So really important that your data will drive the decisions and will provide evidence so that you're able to create a sign or update a sign thoughtfully based on evidence from your users. Other types of research techniques and methods include case studies, as well as audits, which is what I just talked about, as well as task completion exercises and eye tracking. All of these techniques are, again, associated with UX or user experience, as well as there are definite associations with ethnographic research, which is connected with the discipline of anthropology. And ethnographic research just means observational studies where we're observing our users, not in a creepy way, but observing in a very unobtrusive way, and understanding how they navigate through the library facility, how they engage in signs, how long they look at a sign, what signs do they look at, what signs do they ignore. Observation is very powerful. Okay, just want to move on. Hold on, I just want to make sure I did not go to I didn't skip a slide. Okay, good. Okay. Now I want to show you some before and after pictures. So this is really important because I want to give you real life examples of some before and after disaster, disaster signs that are really ugly, not user friendly, not very useful, not desirable, which are part of the components of user experience. And then I'm going to show you the updated sign. These are all signs from my library. So the sign on the left was our cell phone policy sign, and the sign on the right is the updated one. So one of the things that you might be noticing is contrast. So in order for better visibility, you need to make sure that your sign has at least 70% contrast between the background and the foreground. So my recommendation would be having a white background and having a foreground with like black lettering, or so having this contrast of black foreground, white background, so that visibility and readability and legibility are at the utmost. So that, again, really, really important. So you'll notice on the left, there's a lot of text. It says, please use cell phones outside the library. All caps. All caps is yelling. You shouldn't be using all caps. As a courtesy to everyone, please give library users the gift of quiet time. There is a clip art picture of a screaming cell phone. That clip art picture is hideous, in my opinion, just my opinion. And there's a lot of research that shows that, clip art is cute, but it's not as effective as a realistic image. So one of the best practices I recommend is use realistic images. Don't use clip art. It's also hard to read. There's a lot of words, and I would say it's kind of ugly. It's a little bit faded. It's not as easy to read, and also too many words. Now, I do have, a best practice is, try to have a sign with 5 words. Unfortunately, that's not always possible, but, try to have a sign with as least words as possible. So here is the updated image. It is, please, always being polite, not because I'm Canadian, but I believe in being polite. Being polite means that you're being welcoming to your library users. Please take cell phones outside. Texting is fine. Courtesy is key. Please respect your library. So you're focusing on the yes, not the no. You're focusing on what library users can do, not what they can't do. But you're not saying, don't talk on the phone, even though they shouldn't be talking on the phone. But you're focusing on, let's focus on what you can do as opposed to what you can't do. The sign, you'll notice, is a lot easier to read. The contrast is higher, and it's using a sans serif font. Always use a sans serif font when you're creating a sign. When you are creating a body of text, like a research paper, then you would use a serif font, right? So again, when you're writing a research paper, use a serif font like Times New Roman. When you're creating a sign with not a lot of text, use a sans serif font like Arial, right? This is the font of the college. The college actually prescribed a specific font, so that's the font, the typeface that we're using. Okay, here is another 3 different iterations of the textbook sign. So this is a textbook promotional sign, and the first one on the left is textbooks available in the CSI library. So CSI is the acronym for the College of Staten Island. Current textbooks are available on reserve for use in the library. These textbooks are funded by your student government and the CUNY Student Financial Aid Textbook Initiative. It's too wordy. It's way too wordy. It's getting better. The sign in the middle and the sign on the right is textbooks are available for 2-hour loan at the Circulation Reserve Desk. Again, a little bit more simplified. and using realistic image of the actual textbooks that we have at the library. The third iteration is kind of similar. It's got textbooks. Textbooks are available for 2-hour loans at the circulation reserve desk. You'll notice that the third iteration of the sign has the social media icons for our social media platforms at our library. You don't need to do that, but it's just another iteration of the sign. So I would say that the second and third iteration of the sign is much better, less wordy, much more readable, and using actual realistic images that are a lot more compelling than yucky clip art. Okay, so this is the noise policy sign. So we used a sign. I think it was stock. I think it might have been a stock image of a horrible stop sign, and I think we included the words "silent zone, no talking allowed." It's laminated, so it's disgusting. Lamination is a no-no because it's a little bit more difficult to read because of glare. So glare and lamination is definitely not recommended. There are other alternatives when you're producing signs to avoid glare or lamination. Also, I don't recommend using a stop sign. A stop sign belongs on the street, doesn't belong in a library. It belongs in a parking lot. It doesn't belong in a library. It's a little bit passive aggressive. It's a little bit punitive. It's not very nice. The middle sign is a little better, but there's no image. I definitely recommend that when you design a sign to add an image or maybe like a universal symbol, like a universal international symbol for something. I don't recommend clip art, but again, having the compromise, a compelling, realistic photo, definitely. As long as you have permission, if it's of a person, get permission. Having a realistic photo, or maybe having a universal image, a universal symbol. So the sign on the right, which is please be respectful and study in a considerate manner. These signs are large scale. These are big, big, big signs, 24 by 36, poster size, very big signs. One of the student feedback that we had was that they don't like signs that are 8 by 10, right? 8 by 10 or 8 by 11 are too small. So we have design signs that are, 18 by 20, 24 by 36, big, 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 large scale signs. We're using the universal sign for shh, right? Although it's not a photograph, it is the universal simplified icon for shh, right? Even though I would definitely prefer using a realistic photograph, the working group or the committee that I've worked on, which is a small group of library workers who have designed signs, and again, very small group, we agreed upon this universal icon for keeping quiet. So I want to talk about the best practices for printed signage. Some of them are kind of repeated, but I want to just emphasize some of these best practices. I will be showing you more pictures in a few moments. So number one of the best practices is being consistent. So having visual and textual consistency is really important, but you still want to have slight differences to distinguish the signs from each other. So there might be slight variations in how you would distinguish a cell phone policy sign with a no food or no drink sign with a promotional sign when you're promoting a specific library service or resource. So you might want to have slight variations in the way that the sign has been designed, but for the most part, keep your signs looking visually and textually consistent. Use a sans serif typeface because sans serif fonts are used for websites and for big headings. You would use serif fonts for larger bodies of text, like the example of writing a research paper. Having high contrast, at least 70% according to the ADA, is one of my recommendations. And in terms of branding, make sure that your branding is consistent and make sure that your branding is aligned with your parent organization. So if you work in a public library, just be sure that your branding is aligned and consistent and obviously familiar with the larger parent organization that you work for. At CSI, we co-brand a lot. So our co-branding meaning that We have branding guidelines and we have a visual identity for the College of Staten Island, but it's often co-branded with our parent organization, which is CUNY, which is the City University of New York. So the CUNY logo and visual identity is often co-branded with the local college campus. We have 25 campuses, and each of our campuses has its own unique visual identity, and it's often co-branded with the City University of New York. Creating a very small controlled vocabulary list of very specific language terms that you want to use consistently. So having textual consistency by using a controlled list of vocabulary terms like a thesaurus is highly recommended. Reciting your message out loud, reading the message out loud, making sure it's not punitive, making sure that the words that you use are not passive aggressive. You do not want to use humor. Not everybody gets humor. You want your message to be positive, optimistic, friendly, welcoming, and not punitive. So read the sign out loud. Use real images by actually taking real pictures. Those pictures would be more compelling, and I think your users would connect well with realistic images. When you're talking about mounting and placement, place the signs at eye level. You don't want to place the signs too low or too high. So again, let's say the average height is whatever, 5'6" or 5'8", or whatever an average height of an average person would be. Try to focus on placing signs at eye level. Be cognizant and mindful of ADA compliance. I will talk about ADA in a few moments. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there is a section of the ADA guidelines and the 2010 updated standards to the ADA guidelines of 1990. Because I believe it was 2010 and 2012 where there are specific updates to buildings and to signage. So one of my chapters of my books focuses on some of the best practices to be ADA compliant. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to get a fine unless somebody complains. So you don't want to have that situation. So, the ADA people are not going to come and fine you unless somebody files a complaint. But it's important to have ADA compliancy on your mind. And I just want to mention that signs are living documents, which means that you need to revisit them constantly, and you have to constantly make reiterations and have many iterations of those signs, because signs need to be constantly updated, because you want to make sure that your sign is not outdated. Okay, so now, there are some slight differences when you're creating digital signage. When you're creating digital signage, you have to think about some of the 5 criteria. So one of the 5 criteria is the software. So whether you are deciding to have standalone software that focuses on individual signs, or whether you want to have a network player which will focus on a system of signs. It would be a system of many signs that are together and they're interrelated by using a network player that would basically be both hardware and software talking together, the hardware being the physical device, and the software would be the content management system that would control the signs. So again, thinking about individual standalone signs that you have to control individually, which sounds like a pain, right? Versus a system using a content management system playing with a player, right? So a signage player, which again is a piece of hardware that really communicates with the software, being the content management system, that really kind of manages and controls the flow of your signs. In terms of the hardware, you have the option of having a TV display or a commercial display. That is the physical hardware that displays the signs. You have the physical hardware that controls the content of the signs, but you also have the physical hardware that displays the signs, whether you want a regular TV display or a commercial display. Then, in terms of engagement, you also have to choose whether you want a static sign or an interactive sign. A static sign is known as passive, and an interactive sign where you would have buttons where library users would engage with that sign by interacting with it. In terms of design, there are lots of different software that you can use. We use PowerPoint, we use Photoshop, we even use Word as a way to create signs. We also use Canva and to design our digital signs. And in terms of the strategic planning, you want to think about having a signage policy, and you want to be able to think strategically about the messaging and about the content of the sign, the words that you use, the message and the language of that sign, and of course the placement. So the strategy is about, placing strategically, thoughtfully, critically, and I think purposefully, as well as thinking very carefully about the message that you want to convey in that sign. You want to make sure you're not offending anybody. You want to be welcoming. You want to be friendly. You want to use positive language. You might want to avoid using no. I want to be, I want to be as polite and friendly as welcoming as possible. And you can always flip the language so that you're not saying no. It is tricky. It's very, very tricky. But it's all about practice, right? Practice playing around with words and think about using the same words, the same words. So, we have words like, this is your library, and it takes ownership, right? Courtesy is key. I mean, these might be cliche, but I think that they're memorable. Courtesy is key. This is your library. And I think that repeating them over and over sends a message. It sends a message, and it creates, in a way, a theme for our library. And the theme of the library all relates to branding, right? Branding is not just the logo. Branding is when you close your eyes, it's all of the mental images and the feelings that are associated with your experiences visiting the library, accessing the library website, interacting with the library signs, interacting with library staff, and different people who work in the library. So branding as a concept goes beyond the logos. Okay, so here's some of the different best practices for digital signage. So there is something called the 3x5 rule, which is a design rule, which I often don't follow. Basically, that if you're going to create a sign with 15 words, right? So I think 15 words is way too much. But if you were to create a sign with 15 words, you want to make sure that you have no more than 3 lines of text with 5 words per sign. Me personally, I would never, ever create a sign with 15 words. I would try to create a sign with like maybe 5 words, 6 words, right? So I try to create a sign with as least words as possible. But if you were to use 15 words, make sure that your sign is really big. And one of the design guidelines is the 3x5 rule, which is no more than 3 lines of text and 5 words. Always using sans serif for both print and digital signage. Also making sure that your contrast is at least 70% difference between the background and the foreground. Always justify your digital signage to the left. Always be mindful of ADA compliance, and make sure that your interactive buttons on your digital screen are between 36 and 42 inches from the ground. And please do not use more than 2 different typefaces. So if you choose, let's say Arial, make sure that you don't use no more than 2 different variations of Arial. So no more than 2 types of typefaces from the same font family. Now, a lot of times the way that people will engage in a sign is the same way that they will look at a website. They will either scan a website or a sign in an F pattern or a Z pattern. So think about when you are accessing a digital screen or when you're accessing a website, when you're looking at pictures and you're looking at text, most of the time we scan using the F or the Z pattern. Also, in terms of placement, please make sure that you're being mindful of placement, because a digital sign is different than a printed sign because there are different kinds of digital signs. So I will mention that the 3 types of digital signs are point of transfer, point of weight, and point of sale. So let me just talk about these in a few moments, but I want to go through the other best practices. There is a 60-30-10% color rule, which means 60% of the sign should be in a dominant color. I would say like, a white background. 30% of the sign would have like maybe a border, which is something more colorful, and then 10% would be the text. So that would be the way that I am kind of conceptualizing the 60-30-10, right? So 60%, very, very simple white background, 30% border, and 10% text. So that kind of splits the signs, the visuals into 60% that would be dominant, and then 30% would be secondary, and then 10% would be, the sparse, I would say, the text. In terms of the visual hierarchy, there are three parts of the visual hierarchy. There is the title of the sign, there is the body of the sign, and then there's the CTA, which is the call to action. The call to action would be, email us now, phone us now, call us now. So the call to action is all about this urgency, right? And it's all about, doing something active now, as if, the world's going to end. So, email now, email us now, phone us now. You don't have to put a call to action on a sign. You don't have to. But again, it is eye-catchy, right? It definitely catches people's attention when you have a call to action. But those are the three different sections of a sign. And again, if you have less words, you don't have to take advantage of the three parts of a sign. You can have maybe two parts. Adding real images, again, as I'm repeating for the printed signs, makes the sign more compelling and more user-friendly, more useful, and more desirable. So it really presents the sign as it's being taken more seriously. Although clip art is cute, a lot of people can't really connect with clip art because it's not very much connected to reality because it's cartoons and it's cute and it's kind of juvenile. So definitely adding realistic images that really best represent your library is definitely a best practice. In terms of pixelation, think about how clear your digital signs are. Having a 16:9 ratio, which means that your sign should be a 1280 by 720 resolution or 1920 by 1080 resolution. You can definitely control that in Canva. You can control that in Photoshop. Pixelation is really relates to how clear the image is because pixels are the specific dots that are used in a particular bitmap image. So you want to make sure that the higher the pixelation, the more clear the image is. Of course, the image will be more heavy. It'll be a larger file. If you save it as a TIFF file or as a JPEG or as a bitmap, obviously the JPEG is the most compressed file. So, obviously you would want to compress it, but you want to make sure that you have a very high pixelation so the image is easy to read. In terms of distance, there are calculations where, for example, if a particular font is called a 100-point, a 100-point font corresponds to a particular font size, and that corresponds to how far you are able to read it. So for example, a 100-point font means that you could read that digital sign from 26 feet away. So there are calculators that will calculate the font size that you have to create that will correspond to the point size, right? So a font size corresponds to a point size, which corresponds to how far you can see the sign. And of course, there is a chapter in my book that talks about that. You can Google it, and there are calculators. There are freely available calculators that will convert the how large the font needs to be, and it will correspond to it's called a point size, 100-point, etc. And it will kind of parse out how many feet that sign can be viewed. because you want to make sure that you could see a sign from a far distance and to make sure there are clear sight lines so you can actually see that sign. Finally, leave enough space around the edges of that sign so that you have white space. It's really important to embrace white space. So here are some best practices I want to show you because this part is kind of funny. And a lot of this is common sense. A lot of this is common sense. So number one, avoid all caps. All caps are yelling. You want to be able to use bold or italicize and avoid using all caps. Avoid clutter. This is the second floor reference desk in my library, and it's very cluttered. There are a lot of signs on the table. The signs are repetitive. They're difficult to read. They do not have any visual or textual consistency. So it really promotes a negative user experience. I'm just checking the time. Okay. So again, this is known as noise. Noise meaning it's very overwhelming. There's too many signs. People are going to get overwhelmed, and it's really going to contribute to a very negative user experience. Avoiding clip art. Again, clip art's cute, but it's not. It should not. You should try to avoid it. It's pretty cute though, and it's pretty colorful. Avoiding handwritten signs. Handwritten signs are not only ugly, but they're not professional, and they're difficult to read. So it's really simple. If you see a handwritten sign, take it down, because handwritten signs also really promote a very negative user experience that is very unwelcoming and not professional, not readable, not legible, pretty ugly. Avoid mounting signs on walls and furniture and doors. Use easels. Use bulletin boards. Use frames that don't have glare. Do not laminate, but use frames and easels and other alternative means to safely frame your signs. Do not use, furniture. This is an actual shelf from our reference area where the call number signage was taped onto the furniture, and the sun burnt through the sign and it burnt through the wood. This is like a sunburn. This is like a sunburn on a wood shelf. So yeah, I can sand it down. I can sand it down, but this is like a sunburn. This is really ugly. And it literally, the sun burnt through the sign, burnt through the wood, and stained the sign, right? Like a sunburn. Really ugly. AD compliance. Avoiding glare, using sans serif typeface, and having high contrast. Here is an example of clutter. There's an institutional sign with 3 signs taped on top of it. This is super ugly. So again, institutional sign, which is outdated, like underneath, with 3 different signs, 2 of which are laminated. Avoid lamination. It's difficult to read. Messaging. A lot of the times, the message might be contradictory. It might have an inconsistent message. The message might be outdated. It might be punitive. It might be passive aggressive. It might use humor that nobody gets. So it's important to be very, very clear with a simple message that is not contradictory or inconsistent. These signs are super confusing. It uses the word no talking. It uses the word silent. It's using words that are confusing to library users. And be welcoming, not mean. Try to read the signs out loud. So here, I'm going to just show you, these are some of our ugly signs that we had. Some of the signs are threatening. Some of the signs look like a construction zone. Some of the signs look like it's like a red stop sign, which belongs in a parking lot, not a library. And some of the signs are using like all caps. And all caps is yelling. Don't yell. In the world of the internet, using all caps is yelling and screaming. You don't want to do that. And creating templates. So these are examples of our signage templates. Using signage templates creates a unified design. so that all the signs look mostly alike with slight variations. So, for example, these two signage templates have a slightly different border. One of the borders is like a blue and gray, and it's a darker blue, and the other border is a lighter blue, all of which are part of the college's colors. We're trying to adhere to our academic institutions' branding and visual identity guidelines. Most of your institutions will have a branding or a visual identity guidelines, so please use those. I've studied them. I know the colors, I know the different typefaces to use, and I know the different guidelines to use when I'm developing new signs. But I want to make the signs consistent, but I want to make slight differences to distinguish one sign, which might be a policy sign, versus another sign, which might be a promotional sign. Embracing simplicity. This is a super large sign. I would say it's probably like 24 by 36. Very simple. Find us on social media, and I'm showing the different symbols for Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Again, very, very, very simple. Here's our code of conduct. The code of conduct has undergone several iterations. The first code of conduct on the left-hand side, I'm telling you, looked like the Constitution. It was so wordy, no one is going to read it. No one's going to read it. The text was very small. It was difficult to read. It was a very, very large sign, but it was way too wordy, too much text, and also it was too small. The sign in the middle is a bit better. It's "This is your library," and we created a respect acronym, right? So RESBCT. So, reserved group study rooms, equipment, furniture, and books should be used properly, speak quietly, please enjoy food and drink outside the library, engage with library staff, obviously in a courteous manner, computers are reserved for academic purposes, and talking on cell phones is prohibited. So we want to be able to do a lot of common sense policies, but we want to be able to create it in something simple, so we've created this respect acronym. We found it was too wordy, and there were no pictures. So the third iteration is a little simpler. Please respect the library's policies. Food is not allowed. You may bring drinks in sealed bottles and spill-proof mugs. Please use the 1L, that's our building, 1L, the 1L lobby for phone conversations. When in the library, please switch your cell phones to vibrate. Again, all common sense. And please keep noise levels to a minimum in order to maintain an environment conducive to study. All of which are common sense, but we have to be able to really reiterate these policies in a very friendly, welcoming manner. So the image on the right is a sign. It's a very large scale sign, and we're using images that have been used in individual signs. So you'll notice that there is a consistency in using the individual signs and then kind of using the same language, the same images, the same color scheme, and using that for larger multi-prong signs. Like this sign would be focusing on 3 different types of policies, right? So the food policy, the cell phone policy, as well as the noise policy. And using 3 different policies in a merge sign, right, with this one, which is really, really large, and then kind of incorporating individual policy signs with the same visual and textual consistency makes a more unified signage system. Okay. Now, of course, using real images, the before sign, which was really good, please leave the stapler on the table. Very simple, But having a picture of a real stapler is a lot more compelling. And in terms of striving for diversity, use library users who are actually in your library. So try to think about, the different ages, the different cultures, ethnicities, races, and religions, and the different people at your library. Think about the diverse users that will engage in your signs. You want to be inclusive, and you want to, if you are using actual library users in your signs, try to be inclusive by incorporating all of the different users that use the library and engage in your signs. So focusing on being inclusive, which again, I think is common sense. Here is an example of a large scale sign. So here we are really focusing on large 24 by 36 cell phone policy signs, food and drink policy, as well as noise policy. So here is another example of when we've created individual signs and then when we've merged them into a large scale triptych or a 3 policy sign. Be friendly. Try to avoid using the word no. And here are examples of the individual cell phone policy and the individual noise policy where we're trying to avoid using the word no and trying to focus on using yes, right? We're focusing on what library users can do as opposed to what they can't do. Bump points. So bump points, also known as touch points, are the different areas of your library where users make decisions. Observe your users in an informal way and try to think about where they would make a decision. At the bottom of the stairs, at the top of the stairs, upon entering an elevator, when they go into the lobby. Do they make a decision to go to the circulation desk or the reference desk, right? That's a decision point. Do they ask a reference question at the reference desk, or do they go to the circulation desk? Do they go up the stairs? Do they go down the stairs? Do they take an elevator? Where do they go when they enter the library? When they get to the top of the stairs, do they turn left or do they turn right? Do they go to the bathroom or do they go to a desk? Do they go to a group study desk or they go to an individual study carrel? Where do they go? Try to identify the touch points where users make decisions, and that might be an excellent place to put a sign. Now, keeping track of signs is very easy. If you obtain the blueprints for your signs, and if you obtain the blueprints for your library, place the signs approximately by placing stickers, right? I've placed stickers or different little points where I have placed the approximate location of where that sign will be based on the blueprints of my library's floor. If you don't have blueprints, you can use any kind of design software to draw a basic map of each of the floors of the library, and that's where you can keep track of the different kinds of signs in your library. So this is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful idea of keeping track of the signs and the approximate locations of those signs. Now, this is an example of a fake sign and a real sign. Keeping track of your signs. The fake sign is the sign that was produced on the left, which is "Thank you, reserved for staff only." That is not a real sign. We never, ever, ever created that sign at all. And the real sign is "Be considerate of others. Please talk quietly." This is a different generation of signs. This is a pre-2012 sign. I would say it might have been developed in 2012 or maybe even earlier. But the sign is pretty good. It's pretty good. I would say it's okay to have two different types of typefaces. I would remove the all caps. I would remove the exclamation point. So I would still say, "Please talk quietly," but I would use bold instead of all caps, and "Be considerate of others," which is using cursive font. I think that's okay. It might not be as readable as using a traditional sans serif font like Arial. Arial is a very typical sans serif font, and Times New Roman is a very typical serif font or serif. So I would say this sign is okay, But please be careful because there was one very clever student who created this fake sign on the left. We do not have any reserved for staff only signs. We don't have that. We don't have any signs that are reserved for staff. So somebody, either a student or a staff member, somebody created that sign and it looks pretty realistic, but it's fake. It's not real. It's not an actual library sign. So in terms of mounting, it's really important to avoid glare, and you want to make sure that your sign is between 48 to 60 inches off the ground according to the ADA. You want to make sure that your sign, if you are posting on the door, which I do not recommend, but if you are posting something on the wall or the door, make sure it's on the latch side of the door. Avoid visible tape. If you're using tape, use double-sided tape. Avoiding crooked signs, use a level to make sure that your signs are straight. And next types of mounting tips, mounting your sign at eye level by looking at the average height. So in other words, practice and experiment by mounting signs at specific eye levels and specific heights just to see if the sign can be viewed at a distance. Be very mindful of sightlines. Make sure that if you are posting a sign, there are no obstructions and that your sign has a particular point font where it could be viewed at 100 feet away. And instead of posting signs on furniture or doors or walls, make use of sign holders, bulletin boards, or easels, because it's a lot more professional to have a sign and an easel than a sign on the wall or on a door or furniture. Now, in terms of effectiveness, policy signs are only effective if they're enforced. So library staff have to be on board by getting buy-in. I'll talk about buy-in in the next slide. But to maintain effectiveness, all of you have to be on board to enforce a sign. All of you have to be advocates to advocate for respecting that sign. So it's important to do research and to study your audience. So that means that when you create a sign based on the questions that your library users will ask, you don't want to create a sign just because you want to. You want to be able to ask questions, and your signs should respond and they should inform users based on the knowledge gap between users and the library. So you want to be able to ask open-ended questions of your patrons, right, your library users, by using qualitative, semi-structured interviews as well as focus groups and other user research techniques that can be applied to signage research. You also want to be able to get advocates by partnering with different campus groups or different community agencies. If you work in a public library, different community groups and different agencies that would partner with you to be able to advocate for the importance of signage. And in the case of an academic institution, we have partnered with the public library, we've partnered with different campus groups, we've partnered with different departments to really focus on the importance of signage. Because signs are living documents, they need to be continuously updated, and you need to continuously evaluate the signs, as well as really paying close attention to the touch points or the decision points. Touch points and decision points are also known as bump points. B-U-M-P, bump points. So you want to be able to create your signs that are informed by policy. So your signage policy could be 20 pages or it could be 3 pages. One of my chapters does focus on creating a signage policy, but a signage policy informs how you design the sign. It informs in terms of the placement. It informs you how often you're going to update the sign. It also informs who are the people responsible for updating the signs and creating the signs. So, in terms of getting buy-in, it's important to be patient and to compromise. You're not always going to get your way. Buy-in can take years and years and years. So you have to listen really carefully because you don't work alone. I used to work in a hospital, so I was a solo librarian and I did work as a solo librarian, but now I work in a department, I work in a large library and an academic institution. I work with many people. So in terms of teamwork, you can't always get what you want. So getting buy-in means that you have to compromise, and you always want to make sure that when you propose changes, you provide evidence and data to support the proposed changes that you're making. Always provide data, facts, and evidence when you have specific proposed changes, when you are wanting to update or revise the signs in your library. Creating a signage policy will be very helpful to have consistency, but be open to having flexible signage guidelines. So having something that is more strict, like the policy, but also accompanying that with more flexible guidelines will work really, really well because it's important in order to get buy-in to be flexible and also to compromise because buy-in can take a really long time. There are a lot of library workers that you might work with that don't care about signs. They're just very apathetic. They don't care. So you want to be able to get buy-in, most importantly, from your chief librarian. That's important. So my final recommendations, because I can't believe I finished on time, is be friendly and make sure that your signs are visually and textually consistent. Avoid library jargon, avoid all caps, and try to avoid using the word no. Developing a clear message with as few words as possible will be the most compelling because a lot of library users will not read the sign if it's too wordy. So having a few words with a really wonderful, realistic image and making sure that the sign is placed in a strategic spot so that your user will be able to access that sign at a decision point. Do not place signs randomly because that's ineffective. Place signs mindfully, intentionally, and purposefully with a with a strategy in mind. Finally, creating a signage policy that would have a little bit more strict guidance, but also being open to having more flexible guidelines to accompany that more strict policy. Creating signage templates will provide a lot of consistency, both visually and textually. Creating a library brand that is aligned with your parent organization is very useful. So there's also a sense of autonomy for your library, but also a sense of connection with your parent organization. Getting buy-in from your department, as I mentioned like 2 minutes ago, can take time. So be patient. Being mindful about ADA compliance is really important because you just never know if somebody will file a complaint. You don't want to get a fine. And being ADA compliant means that you're being inclusive to your diverse library community. You want to be inclusive. And revisiting your signs, I would say even at least monthly. Like visit the signs monthly because you want to make sure your signs are current, they're not out of date, they have a friendly, welcoming message, and they're easy to understand. They're not confusing. They're not contradictory. They're not punitive. So you want to be able to access your decision points to see where users make decisions and revisit your signs to make sure they're current. Finally, signs are living documents. Be flexible, update your signs regularly because you want to make sure that your signs are not static because that becomes old. Make sure and just have an open mind to change and update your signs. So, this is my book. It has a very beautiful cover. It's published by ALA Editions. It came out at the end of 2021. It's called Library, Signage, and Wayfinding Design, Communicating Effectively with Your Users. You can get it, it's super affordable. If you're an ALA member, you get a discount. And I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. This is my contact information. My email is markaaron.polger@csi.cuny.edu. My website is markaaronpolger.com, and all of you will be receiving a copy of the handouts and a copy of the presentation that we had today. So I'd like to thank you for attending this presentation. Are there any questions? I'm going to look in the chat and I'm going to stop the share. Let's see if there are any questions in the chat. Vicky, if you're there, I'm just going to look at the, yes, I'm really glad you enjoyed the webinar. Are there any questions about anything that I discussed since we started? I want to make sure that everything seemed kind of clear, and I'm really glad it was great. I'm glad. You can always contact me. I'm gonna just share my email in the chat. If you have any questions, if you want me to send you a copy of a signage policy, if you want me to provide any type of advice, advice is always free. Happy to always email people. So that's my email, markaaron.polger@csi.cuny.edu. I'd like to thank you for coming, and I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that you learned something today. And yeah. Are there any questions? I'm just going to just look in the chat. Okay. Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you. And yeah, please keep in touch. Please reach out by email if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any feedback. You're welcome. Oh, hi, Rebecca. I recognize your name. I think it's you. Thank you all.